Okay, so today we are going to start the executive branch unit. The first thing is when the founders were just sitting at the Constitution Convention trying to figure out how they do this, they knew there needed to be an executive, but they weren't sure if it was one person, how long there'd be the terms are for, how they'd be elected. Again, maybe it would be like a panel of 3 or 4 people or some sort of committee. They went over all kinds of ideas. They ended up looking at the sort of England's parliamentary system, and the world today has all sorts of parliamentary systems. They ended up deciding that they didn't like the parliamentary system, and so they make up this presidential system. One of the reasons they did not like the parliamentary system is they sort of looked at it like, and many of you may know sort of how the parliamentary system works, is that if we have a parliament, then, and if I was in class, I'd ask you, how do we get a prime minister in a lot of the parliamentary systems? So the majority party in the parliament will take one of their members and they end up voting that person to be the prime minister. And so you can put a prime minister sort of above, maybe not above Parliament, but the prime minister comes from Parliament. And so what the United States didn't like about that, or the founders, is they sat here and they're like, well, wait a minute, look at that. Now, what is it? Is the prime minister the executive branch? Is that the executive branch and the legislative branch? But those don't look very separate when you are taking a member of the parliament, the legislative branch, and voting for him or her to be prime minister. And then the way a lot of those systems work is if the prime minister is not popular, then they have votes of no confidence and they get him out. And so the prime minister runs the risk of the prime minister becoming a pawn of parliament. And so the United States decides that we don't like the system on the left. We want more of this sort of system. And so we want a system where you have this branch and you have this branch, and then they're separate. And so that's why we vote on, we come up and we say we want an executive branch totally separate from the legislative branch. We don't want that tie-in. We want actually a separation of powers. So that's the difference. One of the differences between the presidential system and the parliamentary system is that right there. And then the president, in the Constitution, they put that the president has to be natural born, which just means basically at the moment that he or she is born, they are an American citizen. So if their parents are on vacation or living on a military base or something like that, then and they're born, and they're a U.S. citizen at that time, they can still be president. They have to be at the minimum 35 years and then lived in the U.S. at least 14 years. No term limits until the 22nd Amendment. So the 22nd Amendment was finally ratified in 1951, and so you think of it that before that was the 40s and the 30s, and Franklin Roosevelt was our president, and he won election, and Franklin Roosevelt won elections in 1932, 1936, 1940, and 1944, and then he died, and his vice president Truman took over. So there are term limits now, 2-term limit. The most amount of years you could serve would be 10, because you could replace a president who was removed or died. You could replace him. And if you replaced him just after the 2-year point in his term, then you could fill out the last 2 years or so and then win 2 elections. So you could serve 10 years. If you replace the president in the first 2 years of his term and you finish that term for him, you can only win 1 more election. So that's how that works. Compensation, the president gets $400,000 a year, which is not a whole lot. I mean, it is for the average person, but it's not a lot for the most powerful person in the world. But then you go, well, what else do they get? They get all kinds of things. Obviously, they have the White House and Camp David and transportation all around, and they have secretaries and cooks, and I mean all kinds. Everything's pretty much taken care of, and all the Secret Service protection and all that. So the job, many years ago, I heard a stat that said it's estimated at being worth roughly $20 million a year. So it must be a lot more than that now. Presidential succession. So if the president dies, the vice president takes over. this is all laid out in, well, that part is in the Constitution, but in the 25th Amendment, but in the Presidential Succession Act lays out the rest of this. And they go from the president to the vice president to the Speaker of the House to the president pro tem of the Senate to the Secretary of State, and then they go through, it actually goes through all the other cabinet positions and lots of other, they go all kinds of positions. Eventually it's majority leaders and minority leaders and others are in there. I'll hold off on the questions about the line of succession. The 25th Amendment deals with disability and succession issues. So that would be if a president is, there's an assassination attempt, which happened when Ronald Reagan was in, it'd be like when Ronald Reagan was in office, I should say, where Ronald Reagan was just in his first term and there was an assassination attempt, he had to undergo surgery. So his vice president, the first George Bush, took over for him. If a president was losing his mind, if he was going senile or something, then this actually says that if the vice president and a majority of the members of the cabinet vote that to take power from the president, they can actually do that. And then if the president comes out of surgery, recovers from whatever it is or something, then he could take power back. So the 22nd Amendment is term limits, and 25th Amendment deals with basically the vice president taking over and when he might take over or how that might happen. So the election process. So the founders, they were sitting there at the convention. They're like, okay, so we're going to have, eventually they decide they're going to have one person as a separate executive branch. And so they had that option where they're looking at Congress or Parliament choosing the president. They didn't like that, like I said before, because they didn't like the tie-in of the Congress choosing the president. So they didn't like that. So then they go, okay, why don't we have the people vote? And right away that was pretty much laughed off. Like, no, people are too stupid. And so they dismissed that. Very few founders thought there was they didn't want that at all, let's say. So the people were too dumb. They weren't going to be informed. So the people don't vote for a president, even though there's going to be all these debates and it's going to be every 4 years and you're going to eventually all going to go, and you're going to go to the polls and you're going to pick a candidate. When you vote, you are actually choosing a slate of electors. So if you go and you check off Biden, you're choosing the Democratic slate of electors, or Trump, you're checking for the Republican slate of electors, etc. And so the Electoral College process is an interesting one. This is the most important thing probably from this chapter to understand. And so basically what happens here with this, and we'll just run through that and then be done for today, is first, number of electoral votes per state. So that's going to equal your number of senators, which every state has 2, plus the number of House members. So that's where population comes into play here. So the fewest electoral votes you could have would be 3. All right, so and there are lots of states that have 3. So Vermont, North Dakota, and South Dakota, and Alaska, and I think I said Montana, but there's a lot of states that have 3. And so you could have 3, right? But so number of senators plus House members. Now, 538 total, because there are 435 House members. There are 100 senators, and then DC also gets 3. So there's 538. So down a couple bullets, it says to win the presidential election, you need a majority of electoral votes. So that's 270. And then going back to the third one here, the winner of a state's popular vote wins the electoral votes. So 48 of the 50 states, as long as you win the most popular votes, regular votes in the state, then that candidate or that party gets the electoral votes from your state in 48 out of 50 states. So if Trump were to win North Carolina, it really means the Republican slate of electors gets to decide the president. In around half the states, the electors have to vote with the way the state votes, and in around the other half, their electors can vote for sort of whoever they want. But now that is, again, it's going to be tested some possibly in the future, but the Supreme Court just now in 2020 made a decision that may tie in at least the 48 states to voting the way the state voted. So it may get rid of faithless electors, but we'll see. So Maine and Nebraska do it slightly different, which I'll show you that in just a second to finish. And to win the presidential election, you need 270 electoral votes. If no candidate wins a majority, so if nobody has 270, which could happen if it was tied 269 to 269, or there was a third party who came in and won maybe 50 electoral votes and made it so nobody had 270, then it would go to the House of Representatives, and every state would get one vote to decide the president. Whichever one gets the majority would win. And then the Senate would decide the vice president. So it's sort of a confusing, interesting, complicated thing, and we will probably review that soon. But I wanted to. I'm going to go back to this, what I was showing you before. So the way it works, I guess I probably could have cleared this a little differently, but we'll go this way. All right. So the way this works well, we'll use Maine because Maine would be, okay, here's Maine, and I grew up in Maine, so this is not going to really look like Maine, but we'll say that's Maine. So Maine has, their districts are sort of like this, all right? So we'll say there's a district here, and there's a district here. So Maine has two districts, which that's going to mean that they get, and I don't know if I can use my utensil here, I guess. So they get 4 electoral votes. And so they have these two districts. So those 4 electoral votes are because there are 2 senators from the state and 2 House members. So you have these 2 districts for House members. So this is the way this election in 2020 will work. We already know that Biden is going to win Maine. Okay, in all likelihood, Biden wins Maine. So Biden is going to get a +2 because he wins the whole state. So in 48 states, that means he would win the whole, all 4 votes. But he gets 2 because he wins the state. Now we have to decide who won the districts. So this here is always, it's kind of like Boston. Oops, sorry, it's hard for me to write on here. It's a Democratic. It's like Boston, Vermont. It's very liberal. So we'll say then that he gets that one. All right. Well, up in the northern part of the state, some of you may have actually in the summer of 2020 seen Trump visited a factory in northern Maine that makes masks. I think it was a mask that, I can't. Oh, it's the swabs. They make the swabs that they use for this testing for COVID. And so we went up there, and there was a huge greeting for him. There was some protesters, but it was this small town just had thousands of people out from all these local areas, and they were all wearing Trump shirts and flags and everything. And so up in the northern part, it is sort of split, but it's much more likely to be Republican. In fact, in the last election, this is what happened. Clinton won the whole state. Trump won that northern district, so he gets 1. Since Biden won the southern district, he would be 3. So basically, the way it would work is Trump could, even though Trump lost the state, he could still get 1 electoral vote out of those 4, and so it splits that way. And Nebraska is done in a similar manner, and so when we come back, maybe in a couple days, I may show you kind of the same breakdown of Nebraska. So it's interesting because in states that do it by district, those 2 states, I actually like it more. I think it's more representative of the population, the way the state votes. Is you look at the overall winner, but that just guarantees you the 2 off the bat. And then you have to look at every single district. Now, Maine only has 2 districts and Nebraska only has 3 districts, so it's a little easier. If you're in a state that has dozens of districts, then it would be a much more difficult thing to figure out. So anyway, I will stop there, and then tomorrow we'll pick up. I'm going to kind of start with the Electoral College, just a real quick review, and then address some of the issues that have come up over the years. So thank you very much.